Have you ever stopped and asked yourself who really governs the Premier League? Not who owns the clubs, not who wins the league, but who writes the rules? Who appoints the people in charge? And who decides what is and isn't fair? In today's video, I'm not making allegations. I'm not putting forward some bold conspiracy theory. I'm doing something much simpler than that. I'm following the official timeline, the official records that I can find, and asking one question. One question that I don't think enough people are asking. Why? Because if the Premier League expects complete transparency from its clubs, shouldn't supporters expect complete transparency from the Premier League? If you're new around here, I'm Adam. This is Two for Joy. Get down there, like, subscribe, hype, do all the good things. Make sure you hit me up in the comments. I think this is it's been a topic of discussion for years, but it's a really interesting video if you can get through the nitty gritty. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, this video, to be clear to everybody, it isn't accusing anyone of corruption. It isn't a conspiracy theory. It's not even a video of me trying to convince you that I'm right. It's literally a video asking a series of questions that I believe every football supporter has the right to ask. And every one of those questions begins with the same word, why? Because good governance isn't only about making good decisions. It's about decisions going through a process that's transparent, accountable, and capable of being understood by everybody involved in this sport. And where I'd like to start is the previous head of the Premier League, Richard Scudamore. Now, Richard Scudamore stepped down after almost 20 years leading the Premier League. And the Premier League explained why. Scudamore himself said he felt like the time was right to move on. And whether you agree with it or not, the decision isn't important. The point is, it was transparent. The Premier League explained to the supporters understood what happened, and that's what matters, because transparency builds trust. And in the search for a new chief executive, the Premier League began looking, and they came up with 3 candidates before Richard Masters: Susanna Dinenage, Tim Davie, and David Pemsel. Now, Susanna Dinenage accepted the role before later withdrawing. And Tim Davie and David Pemsel ran against each other, and Tim Davie decided to stay at the BBC. David Pemsel accepted the role and then resigned before even taking the position. And the Premier League confirmed 2 resignations and 1 that the candidates stepped down. Now, again, I'm not making allegations. I'm asking a simple question. Why? Because supporters naturally become curious when 3 successive appointments fail or don't materialise. So what was so special about Richard Masters? Well, Richard Masters became the interim executive before being appointed the permanent chief exec in December 2019. Now, officially, the Premier League announced that he had been recommended by the nominations committee before being approved by all 20 Premier League clubs. Now, Bruce Buck is the only member of that committee officially identified by the Premier League. Now, at the time, Bruce Buck was the chairman of Chelsea Football Club. No official public record was ever published identifying the committee's full membership or explaining how it reached its recommendation. That leads me to another question. Why did the recruitment process conclude with Richard Masters being the sole candidate recommended for approval by clubs? Was that a normal outcome of a recruitment process? Was that field narrowed to one candidate? Those aren't accusations. Those are governance questions. And again, I'm not suggesting anything improper happened. I'm simply asking, why isn't more of that process public? Because transparency strengthens confidence. Now, in context to this, at the time that Richard Masters came in, it's also worth mentioning the context. Richard Masters became the Premier League's permanent chief executive. The clubs occupying the top 6 positions in the league were Manchester City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Tottenham Hotspur, Arsenal and Manchester United. Those are the same clubs that are widely referred to as today's Premier League Big Six. They were the league's biggest commercial brands. They generated some of the highest revenues. They attracted the largest global audiences. That doesn't prove anything on its own, but it does provide important context for the governance decisions that followed, in my opinion. So then we come to rule changes. So Richard Masters inherited the Premier League's existing financial regulation, profit and sustainability. And that had already been introduced in 2013 during Richard Scudamore's tenure. So Richard Masters continued to oversee those rules. And the next major governance development came in 2021. And on the 7th of October in 2021, as all of you Newcastle fans know, Newcastle United's takeover was completed. Less than 2 weeks later, the Premier League voted to introduce an interim prohibition on certain associated party transactions while a permanent regulatory framework was considered. And then in December of that 2021, the Premier League voted to introduce associated party transaction rules. The Premier League said the rules were designed to ensure that associated party commercial agreements reflected fair market value, protecting the integrity and the competitive balance of the competition. That's the official position. So my questions begin after that. Why was there a new governance framework introduced at that particular point? Why was the interim prohibition considered necessary? Why were the APT rules introduced during that season? And how is fair market value actually determined? Who carries out those assessments? What evidence is considered? What methodology is used? And why aren't supporters given a greater transparency around this process? I think it would help everybody feel more assured that the right decisions were being made by the Premier League if there was more transparency around this process. And transparency is key. This is the heart of what I'm trying to say. So every Premier League club is expected to justify its commercial agreements. They must provide evidence. They must comply with financial rules, quite rightly. But should the governing body itself also explain in principle how it reaches the decisions that can have significant sporting and financial consequences? I'm not asking the Premier League to publish confidential commercial information. I'm asking whether the supporters deserve a clear explanation of the process, because transparency builds trust. Without transparency, naturally people ask, or naturally I ask, why? So again, why this matters. Football exists because of supporters. Supporters buy the tickets, buy the shirts, pay the television subscriptions. Supporters create the atmosphere that the broadcasters can sell all around the world. Without supporters, there's no Premier League. So I don't think it's unreasonable for supporters to ask questions about the governance of the competition they sustain. Not because supporters should be there to make the decision, because supporters deserve the confidence that those decisions are being made fairly, consistently, transparently. And good governance is not only about making good decisions, it's about ensuring the decisions are seen to be made through a process that's transparent and accountable. So I'll finish with the same way I started. This is not an accusation. It's not a conclusion. It's just a question. Why? Why were all of those decisions made? Now, if you can answer me that, then you may answer me my opinions on the Football League, on many people's opinions on the Football League. But like I say, make sure you're asking why. Thank you for watching the video. Hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you think of this timeline of the Premier League. And ask yourself, why? Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.